All right there. So last night I had the pleasure of speaking to the wonderful Benjamin Boyce. He's got a fantastic channel. He's a ex-student of the wonderful college that is Evergreen. Yeah, you know the one. His channel mainly focuses on exposing the social justice carnage that's going on in that place, but he does occasionally dabble elsewhere and other universities like the Wilfrid Laurier situation and others. I'll put a link to his channel in the description. Please go and have a look and maybe subscribe to his channel because it's great stuff. And if you do like it, you'll really like it. After the chat, which went on for about an hour, I went to my recording and realised that my epoxy software had failed to record the audio, and that's really upsetting, especially after a very good talk. And when I broke the news to Ben, he blew my mind because without asking, he recorded the whole thing himself. So thanks to Ben, this now exists as a document, and it's the video you're about to see now. So he did miss the beginning, so there's a couple of minutes off the beginning, so you kind of jump in at the deep end. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Here it is.
Well,
you took a breath then.
It's a contentious term. Right now, postmodernism is being used by the Peterson and company, which is a very vast company right now. So a lot of people have a lot of different views on what postmodernism means, and it's kind of a trigger word for certain people. But I mean it specifically, and certain kind of more in the literary line of things rather than the post-critical theory, post-structuralist way of thinking about it.
No, this is exactly what interested me because I done a master's degree going back 20 years now in cultural studies.
Okay.
Which was in many ways the precursor to modern social justice courses. Mm-hmm. We studied feminism, we studied Marx. My master's degree was a reading of Jacques Derrida's I know it's not Jack, but we'll call him Jacques Derrida. Of Jacques Derrida's Glass and Walter Benjamin's Storyteller.
Yeah.
And I came out of there a Marxist. I came out of there a communist. I spent the majority of my adult life as a communist.
Okay.
And one of those kind of strange neo-Marxists, because I was involved in post-structuralism, got involved in the whole YouTube thing about a year and a half ago, got into Peterson, got into a lot of the debates, and then, as you just said, realised that I was one of the bad guys because I still have got a lot of time and a lot of respect for a lot of the post-structuralists, and this is the real kicker. I can feel my subs crumbling around me. I still have a lot of time and a lot of respect for some of the Frankfurt School writers.
Okay.
And what has interested me is, it's as if I think the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater for a lot of these people when it comes to post-structuralism, postmodernism. Those two are kind of interchangeable, which is always weird. But the strange thing about Peterson is he seems to also be very post-structuralist, a very post-structural thinker. And I think he knows that. I think occasionally he runs up against it and almost sort of quivers to escape it. So I wonder what your thoughts are around all of that.
Well, let's start out by having you define the term post-structuralism, because I always get lost in the terminology, and if we can batten that down, then we can start to build a conversation around something stable.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got structuralism. Which, I suppose if we go back to someone like Ferdinand de Saussure's General Course in Linguistics, that when he come out with that, then you've got like the semiotic explosion, and you've got a lot of literature and art. I know, like you, perhaps I'm more towards the literature, more towards the theory as well as rather than the practice. I don't think post-structuralism was a response to all of that. I think it's a kind of a lumpen thing, this post. It just came after it. It was I think so. I don't think there's no great divide. I don't think you can say these are structuralists, these are post-structuralists. Yeah. Someone like Roland Barthes, he's a structural and he's post-structural. I think that's sort of late 60s kind of thought.
And by structural, you mean investigating, or the mode of theory or criticism or investigation that looks at the underlying structure of any sort of artifact, whether that be an institution or a myth or like a WWE wrestling match, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of it's historical materialism, isn't it?
What do you mean?
Would you not agree? I mean, with structural, what we're looking at. So, if we take a novel, for instance, rather than get overly engrossed in the text that is within the covers,
yeah,
we work out the meaning based on larger social, economic, and political structures.
Yes. Okay.
I don't think post-structuralism doesn't do that. So this is already a bit confusing because I can't draw a distinction between the two at the moment. If you can, I'll be happy to hear it.
I can't. I can't. I get like the whole murky thing of kind of academies where there's all these different movements and everybody's got a different term. I want to get to the most solid term possible, which is why I kind of generally think of myself as a structuralist, as somebody who likes to build things. And so I'm looking at breaking things apart so that I can rebuild it, right? Not just to smash the structure, but to see how it's put together and then see if I can renovate that structure, right? So like everything's Legos in a certain respect, right? So it's more semiotic in a way and closer.
Yeah, understood. I mean, it reminds me of look at painting, and you've got Impressionism. What we're talking about, turn of the last century, about 1900, Impressionism, and then post-Impressionism, and who is that? Van Gogh, Cézanne, are they Impressionists? What's the difference? Where's the join? Does one stop or one start?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, it's those terms come into play for critics of any given field, right? To make kind of, they want to group things according to, in order to look at specific instances and tie things together. But but outside of that, when to a casual observer that goes to the Musée d'Orsay, you know, and see, it's all modern art or whatever. It's like it's in this time frame, you know, and you see a Rene, and then you see a Van Gogh, and you go through and you see that they're tied together by working through similar themes, but every artist, you enjoy them as a consumer, and you interact with them for their strengths and how they're touching you, and you don't really, the terms don't really mean much until you start to argue, maybe not even talk about things, but to start to argue your point.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting that there's even a something called modernism. I mean, that's incredible on its own, isn't it? Because at some point that's going to be 3 centuries old.
Yeah. Modernism means the now, but the moderns were so full of themselves they thought that they stood for all of time. You're right.
I know, incredible, and it reminds me also. There's a definite trend in British education. I noticed it when I was very young, and it came and kept going, even at art school. Decadism. You know, talk about the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, it got to 1959 and 3/4, and then suddenly everything changed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. We haven't started the debate because we're failing to define the terms.
Well, you brought up one thing that we could start talking about, is that you brought up how you think that Peterson can exhibit certain postmodernist ways of speaking or even ways of thinking. And I wonder if that's about how he's tying these different internally coherent ways of thinking into one another, right? So he's got psychology over here, he's got religion over here, he's got the Jungian archetypes over here. And what I would say, or what I want to say, is that Peterson, insofar as he is postmodern, is that he's tying these different things together. And that's kind of like, in a literary tradition, that's what postmodernism means. It's like you have a fairy tale that's running right into a modern day, right? And then it goes into poetry, and it's playing with different forms and stuff like that.
Okay, but when he's challenged on his religious thoughts, and they say, "Do you believe in Jesus?" and he says, "What is believe?
Yeah, exactly.
What does believe mean?
Yeah.
What does Jesus mean?"
That's what you mean. Okay. Yeah.
To an extent, I mean, it's cropped up elsewhere. I can't think offhand, but
yeah. So it has to do with interpretation.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to step off from here. But why? I mean, I can understand why Marxism is the bad guy at the moment. I get that. That doesn't take too much for me to understand. And I think I knew that 10 years ago, but I held on for dear life because I built so much of my personality around it, as well as my thinking. But
Why do you think that is?
I want.
Why do you think Marxism, or why do you think the Marxist way of thought was tied so much into your identity or into the way that you viewed the world?
I mean, it's aesthetically wonderful.
Okay.
The history of Marxism and communism, the incredible artwork that came out of the Soviet period, and I'm not talking about the realism. I'm not talking about Russian realism. That's kind of disgusting. But the advertising, the posters of the strong people, and all that. The whole Che Guevara thing, the endless romantic films of what's the one I'm thinking? Have you seen Land and Freedom? Ken Loach.
I'm not sure if I have or not.
I'll still cry if I watch that movie. A girl's granddad dies. She finds his little box of things, and there's the remains of a red flag with some dirt in it.
Yeah.
And then she reads his diaries, and he was one of the English, just sort of like young Englishmen that went to fight the Spanish Civil War against the fascists, based on the threat that they were coming to England. It's just heartbreaking, and you don't really get that with conservatism. You don't really get that history of being a liberal.
Okay.
Whereas, the revolution, the idea of the revolution is historically romantic.
Yes. Yeah. It makes your life, it ties your actions and your life to something that is all encompassing in a way.
Yeah, and something that's attractive as well. I can remember being 25 years old and at a party, and girls like that shit. They like it. You got your dreadlocks. Oh, I'm not getting a job. Oh no, I'll be getting a Kalashnikov. I'll probably go and work with Sam Terra in Brazil. The land movement. Oh, these dreams. I remember in my flat once, I had a communist flag, a Vietnamese communist flag, and an Irish paramilitary flag with the bloke with the gun and the balaclava in my window. And I came out one morning, and the bloke downstairs, we didn't get on. And he went to me, why have you got those poxy flags in your window? And I said this as if it was obvious, as if it was true, with pride. I said, I'm a revolutionary. And he went, no, you're a junkie. And I can tell you now, Benjamin, he was right. I wasn't.
You're a revolution junkie.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of. Is that you ringing?
No.
Maybe someone in the distance said harm. I am slightly distracted by small rings because I met a girl in the street, and she's only about 22, and I'm taking her for dinner next weekend, and she's been WhatsApping me tonight, and I'm older than her father.
Yeah, okay.
That's a slight distraction, isn't it?
So,
anyway,
that's fine. So you're a little catty. So little.
Oh yeah, without doubt, it's ringing there, but I've moved it away. So where were we? My personality, but all communists do that. It consumes their life. It isn't a small thing. It's a full immersion.
Yes,
and it serves many purposes. It gives you drive. It's got motivation. There's socializing with some of the dullest people you've ever met. I used to sell Living Marxism at my university. But even then, Living Marxism that I was selling was all about free speech. This is 1993.
Okay. All right.
All about free speech. And I don't think the left are talking about that on campus at the moment.
So do you think that there has been a mutation in Marxism? Do you think that what's happening now is a form of Marxism? And if it is, do you think there's been mutations since your college days with the same way of thinking that's morphed into this identity politics, totalitarian, authoritarian, anti-free speech movement?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I've talked to some young Marxists, and identity politics has kind of taken it over. Okay. I mean, I think I've said this before, but I think there's two cultural Marxisms.
Okay.
There's the cultural Marxism, which was the Frankfurt School, a response to the failure of the Soviet project.
Okay.
And it was a question of stepping back, saying, okay, Marx got a few things wrong. We got a few things wrong. Communism didn't take over Europe as we all expected. Quite the opposite. Fascism, Nazism is seeming to. We need to have another look at this. They didn't want to abandon a lot of Marx, understandably so. I mean, the analysis is fantastic. The solution's not so good. So they realized that they needed to have a deeper, more profound look at culture and media and things that Marx didn't really have to deal with.
Okay.
So I think you could describe that critical theory as a cultural Marxism, historical materialism, all the usual suspects. But we can look at a soap opera, we can look at any cultural object and understand its environment, the means of production, the means of consumption, etc. Then there's another cultural Marxism, and I've fucking forgotten. No, I made a video about it. It'll come. Hang on.
Which has more to do with
the one where they just replace the oppressor oppressed with whoever they want. Yeah. Basically, white men and women, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah. Which is another form of revolution. It's another form of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, right?
Yep, there you go.
It's just the same. It's the same dynamic.
But any oppressor oppress, and you choose them, you name them, you'll get away with it.
Yeah, when I first started doing these evergreen videos, like that's when I started mapping out. Well, like one of my theses when I began was that this identity politic, intersectionality, what's called postmodernism, it's not a logical structure, right? So you're not going to be able to interact with it logically. It's not a rational structure. It's a narrative structure. It's an emotional structure. And it has to do with dramatics. It has to do with different characters, right? And different, not necessarily archetypes so much as roles, right? Like it's a mask play. So you have there's one trinity. I can't remember the theorist who said this, but there's the victim, the villain, and the hero, right? So you see that same drama being played out over and over and over again, where there's this victim, which is this minority group. I am the hero acting on behalf of the minority group against the villain, right? And it's really powerful. And there's tons and tons of literature and movies about this. But at the same time, it boxes you in, and it doesn't have a lot of, it never extends into the individual, which is where all great literature happens, where you look past like the role that they're playing in the macrosphere of the play, just the basic, I'm going to rescue the victim from the villain. But you start getting into complex characteristics. You start getting into the drag on the hero, like the moral deficiencies of the hero and the moral superiorities of the villain, where things start getting interesting. Yeah. And because, well, for a number of reasons, but because when it's acted out, say, by a bunch of 22-year-olds in a college as a group, they are not going to have the ability to really look at the richness of what's actually going on, let alone actually fix these systems of oppression, because they can't even handle that. They're thinking in a mob, and they're kind of undeveloped and unfortunately very underread in this current time in our society. So.
It's an amazing point. I was thinking earlier that how progressive values are essentially immature. It's like we're being led by children at the moment. These loud minorities are kids.
Yeah.
And they're changing laws, and they're changing our educational institute.
Yeah.
And like you say, they're fantastically unread. It's shocking.
Yeah.
And while we're on unread, again, going back to when you said about being a postmodernist, and you mentioned Derrida, and Peterson says this is one of the most dangerous men of the 20th century. Yeah. Well, I want to know what that shrug was about, Ben.
Well, has Peterson, I haven't seen Peterson actually interact with even a text of Derrida. He puts Derrida in his grand narrative, but we don't actually see him interacting with any given idea or any specific idea of Derrida. So it's hard to say, which is unfortunate because what?
Sorry, but what he does do is throw the idea that there's no truth up in the air as if it's ridiculous, and then use that to defend his religion.
Yeah, when
he frequently does it. He frequently will say, they'll tell you there's no fixed meaning.
Yeah.
And then he'll say, well, what does believe mean? What's Jesus? What's religion?
Well, we do have to differentiate. There's a number of different Petersons. And I'm waiting for somebody to actually be able to criticize him thoroughly. And people keep on misinterpreting which Peterson they're interacting with. So there's a Peterson that's a teacher that's asking hard questions. When he says, "What is belief? What is truth?" Right? He's entering into deep conversations, really difficult, hard conversations. If you take that out of context and then you put it on the I don't want to call him. I don't want to use. I respect him a lot. So. So I don't want to come off like I'm downplaying him, but like there's the more kind of preacher Peterson where he's being the moral champion, and he's giving advice and he's empowering youth or whatever he's doing, where he's making a lot of authoritative statements, right? And so he's making these claims and he's, which is a whole different sort of talking that he's doing than when he's asking the questions. And if I think you can, I think I haven't done the analysis, but I'm just shooting off the cuff. When he's asking those questions, those hard questions, I'll bet you more likely than not, he's in a one-on-one dialogue with one person. And when he's making the claims, he's more than likely than not speaking to a class or giving a lecture, right? So there's two different modes of speaking that he's engaging in, and it would be really easy to misinterpret him when he's talking to a crowd by overlaying that with when he's talking to one-on-one. So yeah, in a way, once we start entering into like in what way he is a postmodernist, I think we need to like kind of do a close reading, like we need to do a postmodern reading about the context of in what way is he changing his style.
Okay, but that's interesting. And for the record, I absolutely rate Peterson as well. I wouldn't talk about him if I didn't. But when he's talking to classes, when he's talking to students and he's asking those hard questions, what is truth? What is this? I would suggest that's a conversation you almost can't have today without talking about Derrida, without talking about Barthes, certainly Derrida. Well, and I wonder if he teaches them.
Let's get into Derrida then. So you've read Derrida extensively then?
Yeah.
So
that doesn't mean I understand it. Well, sometimes far from it. And I'll tell you something now. I'll hold my hands up to this. Are you familiar with Of Grammatology?
Maybe. That's his paper?
That's his seminal book. It was one of three. It came along with Writing and Difference, and I can't remember the third one in that. But the introduction by Gayatri Chavorki Spivak is better. Is better if you want to understand Derrida than anything I've read of Derrida's. And I've read a lot. I'll be honest with you, I don't think I'd have understood most of the Derrida I've read if it wasn't for that very good introduction. She also translated Of Grammatology.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm pretty familiar with Derrida.
So what do you think how do you think he has influenced the conversation on what is truth? Not truth, but what is truth?
Okay.
Because he's problematized that question. Right?
Well, okay, so you've got things. It's a really complicated one because he hasn't. I don't think you could say he's directly spoken about it in that respect.
But nothing he does is direct, right?
What he said about language, for instance, like we can understand language as something that works via associative chains of meaning.
Okay.
So if we look at the word dog, it always comes up in post-structural debates.
Or tree.
We look at the word dog. Yeah, there you go, tree. That's Ferdinand de Saussure's one, isn't it? Well, we can take either of those. It doesn't describe anything, doesn't mean anything. Our language doesn't work like that. There's this lovely bit Foucault in the Archaeology and Knowledge, I think it is, or the Order of Things. Foucault says, he talks about one of the Borges stories. What's his name? Luis Jorge Borges, is it?
Yeah.
You know, the Brazilian Argentinian. Writes about libraries, books within books within books, all that.
Labyrinths.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's acid reading as far as I'm concerned. He was a librarian anyway. And in one of these books, there's a language or it's a language, and all the words mean very distinct things. Like the word for one animal translates as looks like flies from a distance. And there's another word for another animal that translates as drinks from the water pitcher at noon. And Foucault says he was shocked by this, and he was shocked by the stark, and this is his words, the stark impossibility of thinking like that. I've kind of gone away from Derrida there, but what Derrida has said, and this is my summary about language, something like dog, which is non-descriptive, it works by what it's doing is saying not cat, not tree, not field, not river.
Yeah, by difference, yeah.
There you go. And also with these associative chains, so when I say to you dog, you might have a dog. If you do, you might think of that dog or an old dog or the last one you saw or anything.
Yeah.
And then that associates to other things. Then that associates to other things, okay?
Yeah.
So when I put several words together, let's assume something like the dog was put down at noon. That's my unconscious coming out for you. The dog was put down at noon. As I use those words, my sense of meaning, the meaning I'm aiming at would seem to be rounding down. I'm being more specific.
Yeah.
But because language works via these associative chains, at the same time, I'm opening up meaning. So at one time, I'm being specific and non-specific.
Yeah.
Quite brutally in both senses. So this happens together. So what you've got, and this comes from kind of Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, What is an Author, and all those kind of things. In terms of what you say to me, your intention, the intention of the author or the speaker, whatever, the person putting language into the air or whatever, how much of the meaning relies on you, how much of it relies on me listening or reading, etc., etc. And these are the kind of things, for me, Derrida problematized or sort of raised up. Take the example of a painter. A painter makes some marks on a canvas, and if we look at the modernists, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I was trying to convey this or that," but everyone who sees that is going to have a different relationship with the colours, the shapes, the lines, the time of day they saw it, all sorts of things. So the artist, the author, is kind of redundant in terms of meaning, or are they?
Well, I think it's a level of resolution. I really think it's a level of resolution. And again, we have to be careful that when we start to, I'm looking at this, one of my projects at Evergreen was taking the structuralist way of thinking about language and stepping from the words in a sentence to the sentence between two people to a poem, to a story, to a drama, to a lore, to an epic, to a novel, and going bit by bit by bit, that everything is a bunch of units. And they have a relationality between them. On one level of language, yes, white is defined as not black, and dog is defined as not cat. But once we start to have a conversation, and we're starting to talk about a dog and a cat, we're no longer looking at that difference anymore. We're starting to step up onto a semantic level. Like, say I start to tell a story, like you just did, about your dog, and you're bringing me, you're giving me information not just about dog, but about your dog and about you as well. And then you are conveying something that I don't think is entirely uncommunicative. That is, if you are sad because you put your dog down at noon, and you tell the story of putting your dog down at noon, and you're a good communicator, I will resonate. My feelings will harmonize with your feelings. We will. There will be a bridge.
Are you sure?
It's not one to one, but like I think that human beings have the capacity to overstep that gap between us, and language and story is a way to do that, and that's how religions make sense. Like, even though everybody has a different image of Christ and Mary in their head, if they're a Catholic, the fact that they all go and repeat this ritual over and over and over again, that harmonizes them. It doesn't make them identical, but it does give them a common identity, and then they start working within that.
And I think this I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I'm to an extent playing devil's advocate with whatever we say here, but With archetypes, there is something interesting there, because I do think something has been saved, something has been repeated, and something has been and continues to be shared in terms of what you're talking about. But I think that's what defines archetypes. They've managed something which, on the whole, language struggles with.
Yeah, well, language at one level struggles with it, but what's happening on top of language, right? So I don't think you can necessarily say that what happens on a grammatical level is the same as what happens on a psychological level, let's say, right? Even though you can reduce a story into, like, the structuralists, I think it was Saussure that took the Oedipus myth, and he went through and he did a structural deconstruction of it, where he said there's this group and there's not that group, and there's this group and there's not that group, and they're all in a web. So he translated the myth or the story into like a grammatical level of understanding, but there's more than just that level. There's still a moral level. There's all these other levels of meaning that are transferring on top of these layers. Does that make sense?
Okay, but yeah, absolutely makes sense. Have we got any ability or control over moving up those levels? Again, because if we haven't, again, like the essay by Barthes is called "Death of the Author," because it talks about this lack of ability to have really shared meaning, and for your intention to be carried in language. So when you say there's a level above grammar or semantics, I tend to agree with you. And again, I'd use archetypes as an example of something which has been successful again and again.
Yeah.
Have we got that choice? Is that something we can do?
Well, it's not. It's like free will. It's like this question, and I might be misreading what you're asking, but it's the question of, is there or is there not free will, right? Where I think that question doesn't really make sense. I think that there's gradations of agency or gradations of communicability, and that has to do with competency, right? Am I good enough to convey what I mean to my viewers on YouTube? Right. And when people come back to my YouTube and watch me again and again, it's not because they feel exactly how I feel. It's because I'm making them feel something that they agree with, right? In a way, or even disagree with in a pleasurable manner. Maybe I'm not being specific enough.
No, that's kind of what I'm saying. So you're saying it's not what you were thinking; it's something they can identify with.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I studied when I was at Evergreen was not creative writing, but creative writers. So I took a lot of creative writing workshops, and I was working on my own fiction and poetry and etc. But etc. to go back to my viewers correcting me. And one of the things that I was studying was, one, the teachers, and two, the students. And I saw mirrored, because I was 16, 18, 20 years older than my classmates. I saw a lot of the things that I struggled with. Like young men specifically would start asking the question, well, language doesn't mean anything. Language it's all arbitrary. And it doesn't mean anything. It's meaningless. I'm like, well, you just saying that, I understood that. So can you communicate that thought without me understanding what you're saying? Like, you're already entered into a meaningful exchange. Meaning is the baseline. Meaninglessness and chaos is the exception, right? So, and I think of it as really as, when you want to be a good communicator, you have to see that this, like I want to be a good writer. I want to be a great writer. Let's just say that. I have to understand that there's that which pleases me, which isn't going to make me a great writer. A great writer is my effect on other people. So I need to go out and feel how other people think, and then reflect them back to them, right? I need to enter into a leaping out of my own self and my own little corner of the world, my own little network of associations, into the public dialogue and into what other people feel. I need to study what is a woman like, and how can I be like a woman on the page? Just for example, like the believable female character, right? Like the or something like that. So it's not about whether or not it's possible. It's about whether or not you're capable of doing that as a writer.
Okay, so in terms of being a writer, an artist, a storyteller, comedian,
yeah, exactly.
I've been all of them.
Yeah.
Is it a question of competence, simple ability and skill? Is that what you're saying? That
well, it's not simple. I mean, like, I had a discussion with Brett Weinstein a couple of weeks ago, who's the professor at Evergreen College, who kind of got ran out of there, and he was talking about science, right? Like the science as something that you do. So you observe, and then you make a hypothesis, and then you test your hypothesis. And he was talking about, like, how do you generate a hypothesis? And he said specifically that it's an art. Like, that's not a science. To generate a hypothesis is an art. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by art? Is that just like something that it's a black box? He's like, it's anything that the methodology is not explicit. So I can't necessarily tell you how to be a good communicator, but if I try and I feel things out, I can probably get you to laugh, right? So I can learn how to be a good communicator, a good comedian, but I don't know how I'm going to make that explicit to you, because you're going to need to come at it your own way. You're going to need to make people laugh coming from your own self, right? So it's not competency as in there's this manual that you can go, or there's this program of how to be funny or how to be great. It's so much more complex than that. That you rely on your intuition, you rely on some sort of attentiveness to experience in the broad sense, and then to human communication, and then to human emotion and human reaction and stuff like that.
Okay, so you are a firm believer that the artist's intention is carried through language.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. Well, it's not like it's
That's
not
an amazing response after saying absolutely.
Yeah, well,
absolutely.
It's not like I want my reader to feel this thing. I'm going to say A, and they're going to feel A. It's not a one-to-one relation. It's not I'm going to cause this reaction in the reader. It's that I'm going to present the audience with an array of stimulus that's going to provoke a spectrum of reaction. So it's not exact, but if I'm being funny and people have a sense of humor, they're going to laugh, right? Or if I'm not
but that's a very different thing. Like, let me give you an example. I'm a writer as well. You know what? I got a publishing deal off of one of my subscribers. Bingo, over the moon. If you're watching this, hello Grant. Oh, I'm on it. I'm busy. But I don't think about my readers in terms of what they're going to feel.
Okay.
I tried to. People have asked me over the last year to make a video about storytelling, tell people how to tell stories. So I set the camera up last night, and I was about to. And by the end of the video, I realized I can't. I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't got a clue. I could give no advice, and that was what I came to. I don't know. But when I'm writing, and again, here's a contradiction. I'm not. Here's a massive contradiction. I set out this a minute ago saying to you, I don't think about the audience.
Yeah.
Well, that's a lie, because if I wasn't thinking about the audience, why write it? I know it.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a lie, but
there's an awareness. You're aware that this is for other people, maybe?
It becomes very vague. It just feels vague. The words you've used, and awareness, graduations of language, and someone's going to read, for instance, my novel, and I know what they're going to read in terms of the words.
Yeah.
God knows what else they're going to get from it.
Yeah.
I mean, let me give you a little example. So I was a junkie for most of my adult life. When I got into stand-up comedy, there was a lot of stories around heroin.
Okay.
And I'd stand up on stage at like I remember I'd done the Autistic Association fundraiser. I was the worst comedian for that benefit. I opened up by saying, is this for all autistic people, or just the ones we like who've got special skills? I'd lost them there. But I told a story about heroin, and one of the comedians who was also there, was a lot more advanced than me. He said, listen, he said, that's a very, very funny story, without doubt. He said, but when you open up with heroin, they're not ready to laugh. They're thinking about HIV, they're thinking about their houses getting robbed, and they're thinking about homeless people. So straight away, the same story is, you know, the different associations people have around different things. When I think of my novel, and the timeline is based on a detox. It starts at the start of a detox and ends at the end of it. You know, there's plenty of darting about, but that's the main timeline. I don't have... Someone with no understanding of that world is going into that novel with a very different set of assumptions that will be challenged, but that's different from someone who's got a history of addiction reading it, who's got a very different set of assumptions, and they will be challenged. However, that's two very different stories there all of a sudden, and I wrote one story. So, and that's just two people, Ben. When you read my novel, let's assume you read my novel, we've had this conversation. So when you open it, you might remember this conversation, and you're going to start reading it knowing this. So that's three very different sort of, what would you call it?
Well, perspectives or...
And that's going to be everyone who reads it. So I really question how my intention carries in language.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about my novel then.
I thought you might.
Because I think it's relevant here. So my novel, it takes place between, it's this young man between age 19 and 24. And he wants to be a writer, right? It's the archetypal or stereotypical book about the guy who wants to write.
I wrote that one.
Right? So he writes these stories, or he writes a mythology, right? He writes a little myth, and it keeps on being misinterpreted. People keep on like tearing it down. And he keeps on having this interaction where he sees that it's really strong, it's really powerful. The story is really powerful to him because it connects to all these other stories that he's going to write. But every time he brings it out to somebody, they reduce it in a way and they flatten it to their interpretation. And he thinks, he has this experience with his father. He tells the father his story, and the dad completely deflates him. And he gets really angry. And he's like, no matter what I do, they're always only going to see their own version of the story, which is not the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that story and I'm going to tell it as a different story, and then another story and another story, so that they will already see that this story is being translated into another story. I'm going to try to escape that flattening, right?
Okay.
So in a way, it's an impossible task to say I'm going to present exactly what I want to you, and you're going to believe exactly what I believe, right? And that's the story of Christianity post-Catholicism. It's like, okay, you have Catholicism, then the Protestants, and then they break off, and all these things, and they keep on breaking off. Because once you stop that universal interpretation, that singular interpretation, you have infinite interpretation, right?
Okay, this is interesting. You've just said it. I just want to interrupt there. When you said when you stop that universal interpretation, presuming a universal interpretation.
Well,
I mean, whether you're talking about the individual or historically,
we're talking
was
about
that ever there?
In the Catholic Church, it was enforced by means of, it was enforced, or as close as possible. Like,
no, okay.
But
I'm not sure. I know what you mean. I get what you mean, but nonetheless, they've enforced language, but they haven't enforced meaning.
Yeah. Well, okay. With Catholicism, and this is one of the things that I love about the medieval period, is that you have Catholicism, and it's mandatory. It's mandatory that everybody believes this one thing, and because everybody believes this one book, the Bible, and the set of stories in the Bible, you have infinite variations on that theme. And so you have this proliferation of a multitude of just art, just like with regards to just painting. You have the same story. Like, how many hundreds of thousands of Eves are there, right? And every Eve is a different Eve, but it's still that Eve gains specificity with that one artist, and yet universality because it's connecting to that story, right? So the story is stable, but the visions of the story aren't.
And the meanings of those visions aren't. Let's look at the Garden of Eden, okay? Here's a good example. So the Garden of Eden, you know what happened? You know the story.
Yeah, well,
right?
It depends on which one you're talking about.
Well, exactly. Let's look at the interpretations, understandings of the Garden of Eden up until, say, 1895. Sweet. Then Freud comes along.
Yeah.
And Freud rewrites that meaning. You know, and now, you know, that has affected things. It's changed the meaning.
Or it's added another dimension to it. Right? I mean, because Jung came along right after Freud and like did his whole Jungian thing, right? So
absolutely.
So it's always additive. It's always, and that's kind of the problem that I have with.
Whoa! Sorry, Ben. Whoa! This is important. If new interpretations add to something, rather than change, because I'm standing with change, wouldn't stories just have too much? The Garden of Eden, which has been translated for what, a couple of thousand years?
Yeah.
That's a big story now, but it isn't. You can ask someone what that means and they'll tell you what they think it means. Yeah. They won't give you all the additions. It hasn't been added to like Lego. Bits have been replaced.
Well, okay, but the thing is that we're talking about a physical work, right? The Garden of Eden, as we have it, it was physically cemented. It became a monument. So we have the actual text, right? It's in Hebrew or whatever, and there's probably several different versions when you go back in history. There's probably a few different cores, and then there's the interpretations on top of that of just the physical words, like replacing one word with another word or one sentence with another sentence from one language to another language. But what you're talking about is the interpretation. So the story remains, the text remains as faithfully as possible, but then all the stuff on top of that keeps on adding to it.
See, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with this keep on adding, because what remains are the signifiers, the language objects. What has changed is the signifieds. So snake has changed its meaning through time.
Yeah, okay.
What you say are additions that build it up, and it may...
But can't you look at that? Can't one person read the Garden of Eden story and see it in a number of different ways and apply it to their life in a number of different relationships or a number of different instances?
They can. However, in terms of feeling, certain things they are going to not have a choice to respond to. You know, I think if someone's got a fear of snakes, for instance, that's going to, however they try and read that, there's going to be this over-determined fear of snakes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Sort of influencing their interpretation of it.
Yeah.
Someone who's studied to be a vicar all their life and then gave it up is not going to be able to remove that from their interpretation. And we haven't even started talking about unconscious over-determinations here.
Yeah, okay.
So, but I do agree with you, and you know what I'm saying is problematized when you say that, because I could give you a Freudian reading. I could probably do dare I say, a deconstruction.
Yeah.
And you know, and there's all these different things, but when I think of the Garden of Eden, there's going to be, you know, I'm a context, my history and my memories and my unconscious, and that battle between my conscious and unconscious makes me a context. And that context changes signifiers.
Yeah, well, because you're a living agent. You're not a text yourself. You're somebody who, exactly. I grant the freedom of interpretation.
It hasn't been said before. Okay, so
I did want
let's not go down that road. Go on.
I want to say something in response to that, kind of maybe. I worked in one of the things that I did in my life was work in preschool. And I worked with 3 and 4 year olds, and I told a lot of stories. And then I was put in the toddler room, you know, with the diapers and like the very basic rudimentary language. And I couldn't really tell stories to the children because their language was just emerging. I had to really reduce language down into its rudiments, but I really needed to communicate because that I felt like my job was to give them language and was to teach them how to critically engage with the world. So what I did was I started playing music. And for about 6 months or so, I would sit around with the kids, and I go like searching for one of those songs that would exist on a playground independently of a teacher. So there are these songs that the kids teach themselves, right? Which probably goes back to Dawkins' idea of the meme, right? So there's just this formulation that propagates, and it doesn't even have interpretation. But when you teach a song, when you marry the word to the pattern of rhyme and rhythm and music, it becomes an artifact that is stable, that unifies people. So you have a bunch of kids, a bunch of individuals, let's say, singing this one song. The song remains the same, right? But every different kid has a different nest of interpretations. And I think because everybody knows the same song, they can, for that 1 or 2 minutes, however long the song is, everybody conjoins and does the same thing. Even if they're all in a different body, in a different mind, they're all unified. And so I think that stories, insofar as they are patterns of symbols that act in a predictable manner. They do have something universal about them, even at the same time they have something plenary or something that's prolific with regards to every different individual.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what I'm saying, what I'm putting forward is challenged by the whole idea of the archetype. Mm-hmm. You know, these are stories that have come up in historically and geographically very, very different places.
Yeah.
Why? I'm unsure. It reminds me somewhat, I think it's Derrida again, who talks about the difference between a symbol and a sign. And what he says is that the difference between a symbol and a sign is the relationship between the signifier and the signified in a symbol is not arbitrary. Traditionally, in traditional linguistics. So take something like what does the one he use? Justice.
Okay.
So you know, what is it? The Lady of Justice or something? She's got scales, a sword, and a magnifying glass. So yeah, and these are symbols of justice, and they're seen as not arbitrary. Do you understand what I mean? If we look at tree again, the relationship between signifier and signified is kind of, it's
open,
not random, but yeah. Whereas the relationship between scales and justice,
yeah, it's a network. It's a very, and by non-arbitrary you mean it's set. It's a formula.
There's a reason. It's not just
yes.
But then Derrida challenges that and says if you were to take some scales to, you know, another country or another time, they're not going to straight away go, no, I know, that's justice.
Yeah, but like again, that's context. I don't know what argument he's making. I mean, like there's that cultural context that will shift, but it's still within that group of people. The symbol is non-determined. But once you leave that group or that region, then it becomes indeterminate again, right? But
archetypes seem to transcend those historic and geographic boundaries.
Well, the thing is, the cool thing about the archetypes, and I deal with them a lot. I want to. There's this. I don't know exactly when it started, but I think in the 90s there was this book about the Wizard of Oz, where it was from the point of view of the Wicked Witch of the West, right? I can't remember the name of it. But that started this whole series of like, let's take a fairy tale and turn it on its head, right? And so recently, a few years ago, Angela Jolie was in a Disney movie where she was the bad witch in the Sleeping Beauty story, and they flipped it. So the bad witch was actually a good witch that was misunderstood, right? So I wonder... So I wonder if you take like a fairy tale and you use that variation, or you flip over the variation, it still relies on the original text, right? So it has a double meaning insofar as the viewer comes in knowing the first story, and then sees the flip over. So that's the novelty of it. But if nobody knows that first story, they only see that one other story, and then it becomes its own myth. And then you go and you see the inverse side if you go forward and say, oh, this is a retelling of another story. So
Yeah.
I don't know exactly why I brought that up, but with regards to art, I was thinking about archetypes and how even taking, like, I rewrote Genesis one time, like kind of like as a dare, for myself. And I didn't rewrite it in order to tell the opposite story. I didn't say, like, okay, we're going to make the snake a good guy and we're going to make God the bad guy. That's already been done. I'm like, let's take the same story and just look at it in a slightly different way, and then talk about different characters that had to be there, right? So I started talking about, like, the daughters of Adam, right? And I started talking about, like, I started taking, like, Indian mythology and Irish mythology and, like, plugging it all in and seeing how that monotheistic construct can be added to, right? While still trying to approximate the tone of the Bible, right? In a certain way.
I thought you were going to say that you rewrote Genesis as the end of the Bible.
Just flipped over. So we begin with Revelation. We end with a woman biting an apple. It'd be a great end of the world.
There's a comedian, a friend of mine, and he said, I'm really into watching movies backwards, which you can't do. It's a joke. But he said, you want to check out Jaws? It's about this dead shark that comes back to life and pukes loads of people up before swimming out to the ocean. I sat there trying to do it with endless films for my own entertainment. Yeah. Okay, so different subject. Thank you for talking about that. How did post-structuralism, now we've got an idea of the kind of things it talks about for people who don't know, how did that get fingered for identity politics, etc.?
Okay, this is what I can talk about one instance at Evergreen, and I think I've talked about it in a video before, but Evergreen wanted to hire a composition teacher. And so they had 3 different candidates. And I went to, like, every candidate gave a lecture and then interacted and then did one class, right? And so I went to every lecture and then I saw them. They came to my class that I was in. And one of the teachers, and this is before I really started looking into the whole, like, the outer limits of postmodernism and identity politics. This was right before everything blew up at the school, though now I see that everything was getting there. But this one teacher, she was really into Foucault. And it turned out that she didn't even want to teach composition. She didn't even care about writing anymore. She cared about film. And so her whole presentation was about film. And during her lecture she was giving about this film that had nothing to do with composition, she started to throw out these different phrases that I'd heard over and over again, these feminist phrases. She said something about the male gaze, right? So she showed us a film about the scene from a film of this young woman coming into a room with a candle and a pitcher, and she went around and filled up all the men's cups. And there was just shots of this young woman, absolutely beautiful, just radiantly beautiful, not in a Hollywood sense, but just like she was emanating this life. And so there was shots of her face, and then there's shots of the different men. And every man, I was watching the scene before the lecturer talked about it, and every man had a different response to her. They were all rapt, right? They were all taken aback by her, but that raptness caused them to go into almost a natal state with their emotions. Like they revealed what was going on underneath the surface of them. And then it was really powerful to me to see all these different responses to the same object, right? Which would be the female, right? The same object. Not in an objectification sense, but
go on.
But then the teacher or the lecturer, she just criticized like how that was a nod to the male gaze and objectifying women, right? And then she went on, but like I looked around the room and all these teachers who think the same way, read Foucault, read Derrida, they're like, yeah, the male gaze, right? And I'm like, you guys, you just took this incredibly powerful scene that shattered all these different men, and you turned the men into this one monolithic entity, which you hate that men do about women, that women are just the object of desire. Well, men are just the object of desiring, right? And so I don't know if I can segue to this, but what I see done with Foucault and Derrida is that you have people taking not even their insights, but their clever turns of phrases and weaponizing them. So with Derrida, you have weaponized ambiguity, right? So these teachers use the methods of Derrida to destabilize their opponents. That's what's happening. So they're using post-structuralism not to actually build or to find problems that can be fixed, but to gain power. That's what I really think it comes down to, power.
Because as you hinted at earlier, I've never actually seen any of these people that see the devil in post-structural thought take on a text. They're sound bites. I hear, what is it Derrida sing? How's your French? What is it? Il y a n'ose pas de texte. There is no there's a play on words which is never helpful, but it's something like there is no outside the text, or there is no thing outside the text. And I've heard Peterson drop that one in. You know, according I'm not going to try and do a Canadian accent, but according to Derrida, there's nothing outside the text, which doesn't actually mean that.
Yeah,
it's far more nuanced than that. Of course it is. But yeah, I think that's important. You're right. It's that they've taken sound bites, they've taken clever turns of phrase.
So what's going on underneath isn't the problem is not postmodernism, it's not post-structuralism, it's the age-old problem of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism has dressed itself up in this clever, ambiguous, very nuanced set of ideas, but it's still the same old blunt-forced fundamentalism. We want power, and we are going to rearrange all structures. Using these tools, we're going to rearrange everything so that we can get all we want and defeat everybody else.
That's without doubt. It's a power grab again and again. I see that. And you hit the nail on the head actually there, because I just suddenly thought there is that throughout Foucault and throughout Derrida, and it's very apparent in Foucault, the idea of oppressive power structures. Yeah. You know, Foucault will talk about, what is it, in Power and Knowledge? It's an examination of that very thing. Yeah. And again, I think, you know, when I asked you the question, how did it get fingered for being part of, you know, as the devil, I think, you know, when they do talk about language does involve power, and it does involve oppression, and it does involve all those dynamics. Yeah. Whether it's as simple as saying it's oppressive, I think that's bullshit. I think that's lame.
I watched the movie The Post last night, which is about the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam, and it just, you know, it's a Tom Hanks, not Sybil Shepherd, Meryl Streep movie. Anyways, there's this part that takes place in the Supreme Court of the United States, and there's this shot of the Supreme Court, and there's these huge pillars, and it's very intimidating. It's incredibly powerful. And I thought about like this whole like power, the whole dynamic of power and stuff, and how if you do have any power structure, power it's blind. It's like energy. It's just like, look, my engine has 50,000 kilowatts. You know, it doesn't mean that this engine is going to go around killing the world, right? It's very powerful. Power in it of itself, it's not evil. So once you start conflating the apparent power, once you start equating the apparent power, which is what a lot of these academics are doing with white supremacy, they've taken the idea of white supremacists, right, and they've expanded it to include all of Western culture, right? Therefore, all of Western culture is inherently evil. And why is it evil? Yeah. Because it won. And why did it win? It won because it's evil, not because it was actually efficient. No. Yeah. Which is the truth, you know. It's because it won because it's evil. So that justifies their being as nasty, vindictive as possible, because they've construed their enemy as not even looked at the good parts of it. right, taking advantage of all their flu shots and their cellular fucking phones that they're playing on, right? And stuff like that.
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. That's a great point. I was thinking, I think the video is called the worst SJW is the one inside, something like that. It's another Peterson video. I think someone else named it, in fairness. But what Peterson explains is, and he does it with Nazism as well, and the Gulag archipelagos, etc., that we could all be Nazis. Really, it doesn't take much. And he talks about that. And again, I couldn't help but think of Foucault's Panopticon. Are you familiar with this? For people watching, Jeremy Bentham, an 18th century British, I think, liberal, he designed a prison called the Panopticon. And it's a central tower with all the cells around it. And there's floor after floor after floor. And they're all open front. There only needs to be one man, or the threat of one man in the tower. Because at any point, he could be watching you. You don't know because he's behind very slits in the middle tower. There could be no one in there. But the fact that he might be looking, you survey yourself. And that's Foucault's panopticism. We don't need all these cameras. We don't need all this because there's all kinds of public and private, moral, ethical, hygienic ways of looking at yourself and surveying yourself. And when I heard Peterson talking about the worst SJW is the one that's always already a real post-structuralist. Couple of words there, always already. I spent my master's degree reading those things. It's always already just under the surface.
Absolutely.
And again, I thought Peterson, you've got to mention Foucault in a good light right now because you're that far away from it.
You know what? I want to someday I might have a conversation with Peterson, and I want to challenge him to rescue his postmodern uncles from the belly of the beast. Like that's the one thing I want him to do.
There you go. And Ben. A lovely line to end this on. We've been at it for an hour. I'm gagging for a piss. I've got a bladder full of postmodernism and urine. That's wonderful. And that is exactly why I wanted to talk to you and get that kind of thing. And weirdly, somehow, we clunked along a bit at the beginning, but that's how I feel. That's exactly how I feel.
Excellent, Chris.
I want to rescue his postmodern uncle from the belly of the beast. Absolute pleasure talking to you, Ben. I hope one day we can do it again.
Absolutely, Chris. You have a good night.
All right, man. I'll send you a link to this video. Do what you want with it. I'll put a link to your channel in my thing, and I'll put a little introduction and send them all over, and they'll be your problem.
All right. Excellent. Ciao.
Look after yourself, Ben. Thanks for a great channel. I really enjoy your videos.
Yeah. Yours are great, too. See ya.
Yeah, that was so convincing. Bye.
I don't know. I'm always bad at goodbyes.
Action Man
and his transport command. Tough, realistic models specially designed for Action Man. They're all action. Just look for the Action Man Transport Command badge. It tells you they're the real thing. You can send off for a free workshop accessories kit by collecting the stars with every pack.
Action Man
Transport Command. Only from Palatoy.